My name is Jennifer Boitin. I'm the Associate Professor of French, Francophone Studies, and History at Penn State University, and my only job here today is to present someone who, frankly, needs no introduction, but I will do my best nonetheless.
Oh my gosh.
Emmanuelle Saada is Professor of French and History, as well as the Director of the Center for French and Francophone Studies at Columbia University. She also holds the Carnoy Program Chair of Contemporary Civilization. Now, she's well known for her work in 19th and 20th century French imperialism, with a particular emphasis upon legal cultures and the history of French social thought. Along with numerous articles, one or two of which I will mention in a little bit, Emmanuelle Saada has published her first book on Les enfants de la colonie et les métis de l'Empire entre suggestion et citoyenneté in 2007 in French, and of course it's since been translated into English under the title Empire's Children, Race, Filiation, and Citizenship in the French Colonies. That book focused, among other places, on French Indochina. Actually she has two new books. One that I've just learned is almost out, La colonisation, une histoire du présent, which is forthcoming with Gallimard in French, and a second book, which is called The Exception and the Colonial Rule, the Native Code and the French Empire, 19th and 20th century, which focuses upon all of the legal and social implications of the Code de l'Indigène, which many of us have crossed for those of us who work on French colonial history in our research. Her numerous articles that I mentioned include More Than a Turn, the colonial and French studies with French politics, culture, and society, and also Rethinking the Post-Colonial in French, and I bring those two up because they're going to be, I think, closely linked to the conversation we're having over lunch as well. I should add that Professor Saada is an exacting, a precise, and a thorough scholar whose melding of legal and archival knowledge leads to very rich writing. Please join me in welcoming Emmanuelle Saada. Do not join me yet. Keep going. She had to run out. All right, well, then she missed the introduction, which is a first, I think, but anyway. Now I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do, song and dance, I suppose. Some jokes, exactly. I could also tell you the title of the talk that she'll be giving, so I will do that. Very slowly. You want me to translate everything I just said into French? Is that the next step? Well, the title I will still give is Without Distinction of Sex, the Constitutional Politics of Race and Sex in Contemporary France. And I suppose to fill more time, what I should say is that this will be moving us into the discussion that we'll be having, hopefully a lot of you will be having with us over lunch, which is a discussion about this concept of global France. And I'm not going to preempt the questions we'll be discussing then, but just say that there's a lot of, I think there are some very strong links between the sorts of work that Emmanuelle does in her work and the sorts of questions we'll be asking of this concept of global France and what it does and what it can do for us as historians, and perhaps also what its limitations might be. So, I'm really not sure I can keep filling time any longer. I think we'll take a pause. You can speak. Who unfortunately missed my warm welcome.
It was here. Okay.
Yes, it was here.
Oh my gosh. So I just reprinted my talk, but realized I already put it here. Don't take this as a sign of dilettantism or craziness, although it might be that too. It's just like I'm very honored to be here. I've been thinking about this for weeks, and I need to speak in the mic. Okay. I've been thinking about this for weeks, and I suppose I was very emotional, and I didn't remember I put my talk here. Terribly sorry. Sure, thank you so much. Okay, so sorry about that. And thank you, Jennifer, for those very kind words. I'm sure they were very kind. And I would like to first to thank the organizers of this wonderful conference. I must say the Western is my favorite conference. I was speaking yesterday with Emmanuelle Saada about the Western 2003. Many of you are too young to remember, but in my mind that was the best conference ever I attended ever. So nice, such a nice group of people, and I'm extremely honored to be here today. And I would like especially to thank Megan Roberts for the wonderful invitation and the organization of this conference. So today I will be speaking about a very recent event, something that is really at the edge of what we consider history, since it occurred on July 12th, 2018, 3 months ago. On that day, the French National Assembly voted to change the first article of the Constitution, one that is regarded as defining the very identity of the Republic and its most fundamental values. You have a handout here. I have a lot of quotations. I put a lot of material from this debate of July 12, 2018 at the French Assembly. I'm going to quote some of them. I'm going to summarize some of them. We could not have AV here today, so and the very old-fashioned handout, but useful in some ways. You can bring it home and think about it if you want. And also, I'm going to quote a lot of them, and when I quote things in English, somehow gets a little, my accent gets worse, and it becomes difficult to understand. So please follow. All my quotations are actually in the order of the presentation. So the article that was revised on July 12th previously stipulated that, I quote, France shall be an indivisible, secular, democratic, and social republic. It shall ensure the equality of all citizens before the law, without distinctions of origin, race, or religion. And then later, second paragraph says, statutes shall promote equal access by women and men to elected offices and posts, as well as to positions of professional and social responsibility. So what happened on July 12, 2018? Well, the deputies, with the notable absence of representatives from the National Front, voted unanimously, first, to get rid of the word race. This is why it's struck out in your handout in the article. And second, to introduce, instead of race, sex as a protected category. Thanks to this 25th correction to the Constitution since 1958, the equality of all citizens is now ensured in France without distinction of origin, sex, or religion. So in the course of a few hours, French deputies adopted, apparently out of nowhere, the Equal Rights Amendment that American feminists have been calling for almost a century. And let me say as an aside for you to understand this, the status of this event, that this vote is not definitive. The change of a constitution is not definitive, since a revision of the French constitution requires that it needs to be approved independently by the Assembly, then by the Senate, and then by the Assembly and the Senate assembled as a Congress. So there is a three-step process here, and we are at the first step. What happened is that this process of revision got stalled this summer because of the very acute political crisis generated by the Benalla affair. I don't know if you've heard about it, but that has mobilized actually the Senate and the Assembly for a few weeks with talks and commission meetings and stuff. So the process of the revision is scheduled to restart in January 19th. But here we have the first step. Today, my main archive is this parliamentary debate that led to this vote. I would like to try to understand this substitution, which might strike the American historian of France as both completely obvious, right, given the general ideology of colorblindness in French political discourse, and also rather surprising, since gender equality has never been at the forefront of political debates in France. So what happened? One way to start would be to notice that many other changes were on the table that day. The deputies had proposed literally thousands of amendments to the first article of the Constitution. Some advocated to qualify the Republic, right, in the first sentence, as ecological, participating in the European Union as being solidaire, laïque, or even archipelagic. That was a qualification that was brought forward by the deputies from the Overseas Department. Others wanted to extend the list of constitutional protections to include, I quote, the rights of children, the equality of geographical and regional origins, or the protections against political discrimination. And that was a move by the France Insoumise, the party of Jean-Luc Mélenchon, some members of which had apparently lost their jobs after running as candidates of the party in the previous parliamentary elections. Other deputies insisted that the first article should include the mention of real equality, which some pushed under a different guise by advocating for the expression equality of opportunities, égalité des chances. These two last requests were quickly rebuffed. There was a consensus on the idea that the Constitution is about principles, not reality, and something that ordinary law, or even more so public policies, had to deal with. One amendment took a more radical position. It stated that there should be no enumeration of protections whatsoever. So the first article should simply state that the Republic shall ensure the equality of all citizens before the law without distinction. Full stop. This generated some discussion, but got ultimately rejected on the ground that equality needs to be understood in regards to specific situations. There could be no equality in absolute terms, but always the equality of something or of someone. In the context of the discussion, the head of the legislation commissions reminded his colleagues that Article 1 of the 1789 Declarations of the Rights of Man and Citizens really included a statement of universal equality, right? Les hommes naissent libres et égaux, en droit. And that the 1789 Declaration of Rights is part of what we call in France the bloc de constitutionnalité, the ensemble of the four texts, and this gets a little technical, hence the handout, the four texts in France that have constitutional value today. That is the Constitution of 1958, the preamble of the 1789 Declaration of the Rights of Citizens, Man and Citizens, along with the preamble of the Constitution of 1946, which is still applicable in France, and the Charter on the Environment of 2004. So the four texts in France are what we call the bloc de constitutionnalité. They have a constitutional value, right? So in the debate, there were some references to the Declaration and to the preamble of 1946, as you're going to see, because it says it's already there in some ways, right? In the end, though, none of these many propositions that I mentioned passed. The only two amendments that were voted on concerned the suppression of race and the inclusion of sex. Many in France have commented on this elision of race, mostly in a celebratory mood. Fewer have noted the introduction of sex, as if it were an obvious or consensual issue. Nobody has commented on the substitution between the two, which to me is the most interesting part of this event. Both moves used an identical logic, grounded in a naturalistic vision of the social world and of the Constitution. What I would like to do today is to explain this common logic, using not the anthropological or the political scientist toolbox, which would certainly be very useful in this context, but an historical perspective. So let me start with the suppression of race. What happened there? It is often said in the French historiography of France, and this was evoked during the debates. The deputies are very keen on quoting historical work, interestingly. It was said that the first occurrence of the word race in French law is to be found in the first anti-racist law of 1939, the Décret-loi Marchandeau, which criminalized defamation against groups belonging to a specific race or religion. This first use was quickly followed up by a clearly discriminatory usage of the word race with the infamous statuses on the Jews of 1940 and 1942, which defined the Jewish race as the target of many discriminatory practices. alongside many other historians, some of them are here today, have shown that colonial law made race a legal category much earlier than that, starting in the 19th century. After World War II, the word race was reintroduced in the preamble of the Constitution of 1946. And you have this preamble, the first article on your handout. That preamble solemnly declared that after the victory against regimes that tried to subject and degrade the human person, la personne humaine, the French people proclaimed again that each human being, without distinction of race, religions, and belief, possesses inalienable and sacred rights. The explicit connection here between the mention of race and the condemnation of racism was consensual in 1946. The article was written and introduced without leaving any trace of a debate. Similarly, in 1958, the redaction of Article 1, which was just revised, very much drawing from the 1946 preamble, included race without any discussion, or at least any discussion I could find in the archives. Starting in the 1990s, though, the presence of the word race in the Constitution of the French Republic became the object of scholarly and political debate. Why should the most fundamental document of the Republic mention race if everybody agreed that humanity was one and races did not exist or did not really exist? Didn't the very presence of the word in the Constitution give credence to the idea that there were indeed several distinct races and thus encourage racism? That was the question, that was the way the question was framed in the 1990s. This discussion happened in parallel, but also in connection to the heated debate on the racial statistics, it's statistique ethnique, about which you've heard, I'm sure, and which, as you all know, are not allowed by French law, on the basis, by the way, of the first article of the Constitution as it exists today. In 2002, a communist deputy introduced the first bill for the elimination of the word race in the Constitution, arguing that the very presence of the word contradicted the principle of colorblindness, a constitutive element of French universal republicanism. At the time, and I find this very interesting, was deputy on the right who said that eliminating the word race would weaken anti-racist policies. So this didn't go through. In 2008, ecologist deputy Noël Mamère tried again, and he argued then that, I'm quoting him, science has proven that the notion of race is inoperative and it should be replaced by human species. He must not have thought very long about this one, right? Because saying equality of all citizens before the law without distinctions of origin, human species, or religions, does not work very well, right? Robert Badinter, the former Minister of Justice of François Mitterrand, opposed the move in the Senate on two grounds. First, he evoked international law that was binding France, and notably the 1948 Universal Declaration of the Human Rights, the UN Declaration of Human Rights, and the 1950 European Convention on Human Rights, which both mention race as a protected category, right? So France, being part of these treaties and agreements, cannot get out of it. He also opposed to a move that, I quote, would redact the condemnation of racism from our fundamental law. And at that moment, that was the end point of this debate in 2008. In March 2012, at a political rally where he presented his program for overseas departments, candidate François Hollande promised to eliminate the word race from the Constitution. Like many other of his promises, this went nowhere. In 2013, though, the parliament, with the socialist majority at the time, voted a law to suppress race and its derivations, like racial, from ordinary legislation, something that is much easier to do, obviously, than revising the Constitution. So the idea was, let's start there, because we can do it in legislation, let's go to the Constitution maybe later. So this applied to 59 laws in France that have either the word race or racial. In most of the cases, the word race and racial were replaced by racism and racist. So racial hatred, for example, became racist hatred. In 2 cases only, this substitution was not possible, and the phrase so-called race was used instead. So, racial origin became so-called racial origin. The motive of the promoter of the law was, I quote, to signal that races do not exist, only racism does. And that France, again I quote, intends to fight it with the utmost resolution. And for him, language was a battlefield. He added, words are important. They have a symbolic weight. And quoting Albert Camus, the French Parliament, naming an object inadequately is to add to the woes of the world. But at the time, this attempt at purifying French language did not go very far. Deputy voted the bill, but the Senate, and frankly for a reason that I'm not sure I clearly understand, because this is not really my the substantive research I'm engaged in, and I need to do a little more work on this one. But the Senate at the time actually decided not to examine this change. So this change I've been speaking about, again, was voted by the Assembly, but in 2013, kind of cleaning up of French ordinary law, but didn't pass, was not even examined by the Senate. In July 2018, the debate was reopened. Led by deputy of En Marche, behind Emmanuel Macron, who has put on the agenda of his presidency a massive institutional reform, the National Assembly examined the Constitution line by line and started with, again, a unanimous vote to redact race from it. Drawing from an almost revolutionary rhetoric, members of all parties evoked the emotion and the pride they had in participating in this suppression, which was, in the words of one of them, a step forward for humanity. A close reading of these fascinating debates, I'm so fascinated that I actually gave them to you because I found those documents in themselves so rich. A close reading of these debates indicate that there were mostly 3 main arguments in favor of the suppression of race: historical, scientific, and I would say philosophical. One of the first deputies, and here you have the arguments listed on your handout, one of the first deputies to take the stand suggested that, I quote, the notion of race no longer has any political nor scientific ground. So let me turn first to the idea of an obsolete political ground. One argument was that race had been historically introduced to combat the racial theories at the foundation of Nazism, and that this history was long past. Another idea was that race is negatively associated with colonialism. Getting rid of its mention in the Constitution would mark the endpoint of a long fight of several centuries, which has involved victims from all forms of barbarism in the world. End of quote. And that would constitute a correction to French history. Another, rather different historical argument will be more familiar to the historians of 19th century France who are here. Since France is made of a layering of multiple identities, un empilement d'identités multiples, race is not a relevant concept in the French context. Here we could point, I think, to the irony that the reference to identity reinvests the idea of race in the very act of denying it, right? But more largely, deputies expressed the sentiment that the suppression of race would put an end to the ambiguities of the word that have resulted from its historical meaning and uses. Clearly, they were giving themselves the task of cleaning up a certain history from which France had inherited a terminological mess. By far, though, the main source of legitimacy for the suppressionists was science. Deputies evoked social sciences once, with one mention of Claude Lévi-Strauss, who was somewhat erroneously quoted as having said that there was only one human race. But one after the other, the deputies discussed the notion of the notion of race from the point of view of biology and genetics. In a nutshell, race had to go from the Constitution because it was an invalid scientific concept. Dozens of deputies took the stand to repeat that, I quote, the concept of race is not operative for the human species, as is recognized by scientists, and to reaffirm the unity of the human species, or to remind each other that the concept of race was rooted in the 18th century, and that, quote, modern science and molecular biology have refuted it. One deputy reaffirmed that 99.99% of the genetic patrimony is common to all humanity, forgetting, maybe voluntarily or involuntarily, that 99.98% of the genetic patrimony of the humanity is shared by primates. To all, it was obvious that the Constitution should be in conformity with scientific realities. Other arguments were more philosophical in nature, at least implicitly, in the sense that they engage a certain philosophy of language. For many deputies, the problem was that the word race was polluted and polluting word that authorized, legitimized, and maybe even produced racism. Suppressing the word, race, was then the best way of getting rid of the thing, racism. One deputy, for example, affirmed that the use of the word itself as applied to the human species is shocking and dangerous. Another, that race was an abominable word, in the name of which we have not only produced the worst theories in the entire history of humanity, but also applied them. In this context, that you might find a little funny, one deputy of the République En Marche evoked with emotion the trauma she experienced when, while studying in an American university, she had to check Caucasian on a form. And I'm not kidding. In the mind of many deputies, suppressing this tainted word would be both symbolic and effective. On the symbolic side, one could see the elision of race as an expression, I'm quoting, an expression of national solidarity against all forms of racism. Because getting rid of race is to say no to racism. One speaker affirmed that with our vote, we will get rid of a stain on our constitution and make our country greater. But deputies did not stop at symbols. They considered that symbols had effects. But it is important to note, mostly discursive effects, since for them, in this debate, racism was constantly described as a theory, as an ideology, as a discourse. One deputy summed it up by saying that suppressing race in the Constitution will not silence all discourses, but at least will prevent them to find any legitimacy in the fundamental law. Until now, the Constitution has been legitimizing the idea that there were distinct races. In this hours-long debate, never were the current social, economic, and political realities of race discussed. All of this, at least to ordinary Americans, maybe not to specialists of France, is surprising. Only very few deputies identify a potential problem with the suppression of race, that is, that it would make more difficult to fight against racism. And absolutely nobody made the point that erasing the phrase that there should be no distinction according to race from the Constitution, distinction of race from the Constitution, would make it possible to affirm that they actually should be. Nobody made that argument. Those who approached this terrain agreed that anti-racist legislation and accompanying public policy would leave enough legal tools to fight racism. They also noticed that the word race would stay in the bloc de constitutionnalité, which I evoked earlier, since the preamble of 1946, which you have on your handout, could not be changed. And it's part of the constitutional text. They also remarked that the mention of origin offered protection, since race, after all, is one form of origin. But this argument that origin is useful because it denotes something like racial origin is particularly puzzling to me, at least, because it shows that the problem is really with the word of race, not the idea of it. Some deputies went further in this line of argument. They suggested to put origins in the plural in Article 1, to take into account multiple forms of discriminations endured by citizens based, and here I quote one of the deputies, based on their ethnic, genetic, cultural, or regional origins. Here the mention of genetic is again a way for the idea of race to return in the Constitution without utterance of a tainted word. It is clear here that it's not that easy to suppress race from our political lexicon. The plea for including origins in the plural was rebuffed, not on a substantial, but on a grammatical ground. Sans, in French, sans distinction, has to be followed by singular. Finally, a last tactic to suppress race without disarming the French state against racism was to have the word preceded, as was done in the 2013 cleaning up of French law, by the phrase so-called, in order to take into account a sociological reality which remains. That's the only time when you see the word social in any form appear in this debate. But this went nowhere. Again, the ambience was consensual. On July 12, 2008, deputies mentioned many times their pride and emotion. Skepticism was not on the agenda. Only one deputy hinted at the possible disconnection between words and things, and rather obliquely mentioning that the blanket equality affirmed in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizens in 1789 did not prevent the continuation of slavery until 1794. One deputy made that point. Another one doubted that science was a good ground for writing a constitution, since scientific knowledge evolves quickly, and that actually there were currently many important debates in science on the very idea of species. So, how to understand this unanimity in the suppression of the word race itself, even more so, as I have pointed out, than the idea of it? I think that the history of the uses of the word race can be helpful here. The success of natural history and later anthropology in the 19th century popularized the use of race, an ubiquitous word in 19th century scientific, literary, and political discourses. Yet this diffusion never went without critique. The first use of race as a systematic key of explanation of human history in the French context, in Gobineau's essay on the equality of human races in 1853, was met with considerable skepticism in France, and notably by Gobineau's mentor, Tocqueville, who denounced the materialism, anti-Christianism, and fatalism implied by the concept of race. Historians of the nation, from Michelet to Renan, and later Seignobos, found race without merit in the French context, since France was made up of a melting pot of different races. She was also the result of a political, not biological, endless process of auto-creation. I will not retrace here the history of the doctrine of the nation, which you all know very well, but I can't resist mentioning the last words of Jules Michelet, 1864, Bible de l'humanité. Ta race est 89, your race is 89. I think that sums up pretty well the idea of those 19th century historians. They went even further, from asserting that race was meaningless to affirming that it was a dangerous concept to ban from the political lexicon at the time. That is very clear in Renan's famous 1882 lecture, What is a Nation?, where he says, I quote, "The study of race is of crucial importance for the scholar concerned with the study of humanity." It has no applications, however, in politics. And later, in the same text, warns against ethnographic politics. Today, you use it against others. Tomorrow, you may see it turned against yourself. This said, it is mostly during the two deep crises of the late 1890s and of the 1930s that the anti-racist cause focused on disqualifying the word race itself. During and after the Dreyfus Affair, Durkheim and his disciples saw anti-Semitism as mostly the product of a racial doctrine of the time, the doctrine des races. Thus, the political battle had to be fought in the field of concepts. Sociological reasoning was the main weapon here in showing, I quote again Durkheim in a 1897 text, in showing that the concept of race does not correspond to anything definite. A similar logic was at work in the 1930s when anti-fascist intellectuals tried to fight racism or fight the rise of racism by spreading the idea of the inanity of the notion of race. The Encyclopédie Française, a massive collective project to fend off fascism by enlightening the masses, a project that was aided by historian Lucien Febvre in the 1930s, the Encyclopédie Française devoted a full volume to the human species, in which a physical anthropologist, Henri Neuville, a very interesting guy, denied at length the scientific validity of the concept of race as applied to human beings. And that was the work that needed to be done. Race doesn't exist, or at least in scientific reality. These attempts at fighting racism by discrediting the validity of the concept of race dominated the debate after World War II, from the social to the biological sciences. From the 1951 UNESCO Declaration on Race and Racial Difference to the many publications by geneticists in France, starting in the late 60s, a large mass of text underline the lack of scientific ground for the concept of race. This text, often published in newspapers, meant to address an audience beyond the specialists, posing implicitly a strict correspondence between scientific and ordinary language. Since race had originated in science, and since science had subsequently proven its inanity, it was time for the genie to go back into the bottle. As we have seen, all these texts provided the main arguments for the suppressionists in the 2000s and in 2018. Now, let me turn to the addition of sex to Article 1 of the Constitution. The first thing to notice is that it generated much less debate than the suppression of race. Pride and emotion were not on display that day when it came to sex, as if this change was a trivial, or at least a logical thing to do. The group that was pushing for this addition is the Délégation aux droits des femmes et à l'égalité des chances entre hommes et femmes, a non-partisan parliamentary commission whose role is to promote women's rights and the equality of opportunities between men and women. This commission was created in 1999 in the wake of the law on parité, the law on parity, which, as you know, still favors, the law that favored the equal political representation of men and women at all levels, and whose spirit was included in one of the previous constitutional revisions, first in 1999 and then in 2008, with the addition of the second paragraph that you have on the handout, right? So the second paragraph says, statutes shall promote equal access by women and men to elected offices and posts, as well as to position of professional and social responsibility. That is an addition that was actually, that's something that was added in 2008, that second paragraph, right? And that's really a constitutional translation of the loi sur la parité and the law on political parity. I find fascinating to read the 2018 arguments in favor of the addition of the word sex, the addition of the word sex in parallel to those for the suppression of the word race. For several deputies, The main ground for including sex in 2018 was that, I quote, women are still victims of a structural discrimination in our country. And lots of work needs to be done to make women's rights real. Here, the deputies do not emphasize the symbolic aspect of the Constitution, right? But on the contrary, its potential performative function. And if one were to apply this argument to the suppression of race, one would reach the absurd, or at least absurd to me, to you, I suppose, the absurd conclusion that people of different races are not victims of structural discrimination because races do not exist. Another case was made by some deputies that, I quote, the equality of men and women is a foundation of our society and that it concerns all of us. Again, one very skeptical reader of these debates could conclude that the equality between different racial groups does not concern all of us because races are not real. A third justification for the inclusion of race in the Constitution by the deputies was more coherent with those deployed in favor of suppressing race, namely the unity of humanity. Might sound a little awkward, right, to speak about the unity of humanity when referring to sexes, but it makes more sense if one remembers the argument that were made in favor of parity in 1999, and actually the argument that made parity possible in 1999. At the time, parity, la loi sur la parité, was made acceptable only because it was presented not as a system of quotas, nor as a measure of affirmative action, but on the contrary, as a better image of the universal human condition. The discourse on parity envisioned humankind as consisting of two complementary halves, male and female. A democracy lacking in political parity between men and women would fail to acknowledge this natural and universal fact, and would thereby lack legitimacy. Here, sexual difference was regarded as part of an anthropological order, in virtue of which sexual difference precedes all other forms of differentiation. As one very high-profile deputy put it at the time, that was Roselyne Bachelot, I quote, "Sexual difference is primordial, and all other differences are contingent or transitory." So as you see, equality between the sexes had already been discussed in 1999 in a very specific way, granted. And one could say that sexual equality was already in the Constitution, right? Not only because of the second addition to the first article, which you have, right, the second paragraph, but also because of the preamble of 1946 that already stated that law, I quote, "law ensures equal rights to women in all domains." So in a way, that was already there. Why adding it? Why add it? Why add sex on the non-distinction clause? So let me suggest my own interpretation here. It's maybe a little technical, so I'm happy to answer questions, but I would say that the universalist argument in 1999 was strategic. Feminists in France understood that it was the only way, this reference to a universal anthropological order, that was the only way to make parity acceptable. But the clause in the Constitution that there should be equal access by women and men to elected offices and positions of professional and social responsibility opened the door to many, many claims in France. Interestingly enough, for you, it has been especially the case in universities, where women ask for parity in many kinds of committees, especially in hiring committees. So there's been a lot of legal cases generated by this second article. And these demands generated decisions by the French Constitutional Court, the Conseil constitutionnel, which guarantees the application, the right application of the Constitution in France. And the Constitutional Court, the Conseil constitutionnel, consistently decided that the second paragraph of Article 1 that you have affirmed a constitutional principle, not constitutional individual rights. So that was about the law. It was not you could not call, right? On the second article, if you felt like you were discriminated as a woman, you could not call on that one. It was just a guiding principle for lawmakers. I believe, but in the absence of elaboration by the deputies and commentary by constitutionalists, I'm not entirely sure that this past July, a much more feminine National Assembly added sex in the first paragraph to create this individual right. And that now victims of gender discrimination will be able to invoke the first article. Frankly, I have to do more research on that point and also have to wait for future constitutional decision by the Constitutional Council to see how this develops. But I think this is a real, substantive, important innovation to French laws. It was not just, redundant with the protections that already existed. So, the inclusion of sex might then look like a substantive and great innovation. But let me emphasize one last and very important parallel with the suppression of race, which should make us pause. In July, during the debate, a group of deputies asked for the word gender to be included in the Constitution instead of sex. They argued, I quote, and again it's in your handout, gender is different from sex as it refers both to social roles as well as personal identification, and they said that some citizens are victims of discrimination because of their gender identity. Other deputies wanted sexual orientation to be added to the protected categories. Both claims, both requests were rejected with arguments which echo the naturalist logic at work in the suppression of race. Sex was said to be biological and hormonal, while gender, here I'm quoting all these things you have, and I don't want to do the quoting marks all the time, it's going to be making me dizzy and you too, but while gender is related to the person, it is a form of very personal identification, totally distinct from sexual identity. I let you read, now or later, the long intervention by the Ministry of Justice, Nicole Belloubet, who closed the debate. In substance, she said that sex is a biological, she used the word genetic and biochemical, reality, while sexual orientation is behavioral, and gender refers to the ways in which individuals manage their genetic identity. There would be a lot to say here about the inclusion of a managerial logic. I won't go there. In other words, the notions of sexual orientation and gender imply a form of agency. They don't carry, and here I'm quoting the Ministry of Justice, the necessary genetic implication of sex. This was on this ground that sex was introduced, right? That's a closing argument before the vote. I think that one could not sum up more eloquently the naturalistic determinism, which paradoxically leaves space for some individual agency, but ignores social and economic determinations of race, sex, and gender. Before I wrap up, let me say a few words about the text that was modified, the Constitution, obviously not an ordinary document. As I said, in July at the Palais Bourbon, you could hear echoes of the effervescence of revolutionary assemblies. When they eliminated race from the text, deputies braided themselves for having reactivated the more than 200 years old pact between the Republic and equality. They felt that they were sending a message to the world, which, that's on your handout, which would be necessarily perceived as perfect. Even though, even though the frequent modifications of the Constitution indicate some flexibility and lack of sacredness, the text as in the American context, right? Again, this was the 25th modification of the Constitution since 1958. It is still considered as a place where fundamental principles are articulated. A large part of the debate bore on the distinction between ordinary law and the Constitution. Deputies repeated numerous times that measures to fight discriminations belong to law and policy, not to the Constitution. So ordinary legislation and policy, not to the Constitution. The dividing line here appeared to be between real things, on one hand, and principles and symbols on the other. Yet, I would say, entrusting the fight against racism to policies is highly problematic in France today, because all indicators show that practices of racial discriminations are on the rise, while anti-discriminatory policies based on race, emergent in the 1990s, have been more or less abandoned in the past 15 years, or at least they have been relegated at the municipal level. If we leave this very important question aside and follow the deputies in holding the Constitution as a symbolic statement of fundamental principles, a striking tension between two different conceptions appears. In July, on one hand, deputies seem to have attributed a performative role to the Constitution, following the etymology of the word constitution, a document that organizes power, but also constitutes society by enunciating common values. It is the ultimate essence of the social contract, as one deputy said during the debate. In suppressing race, deputies felt that the Constitution was confirmed in its mission to reinforce the feeling of national belonging, something that we very much need in France today. The document here is viewed as producing a certain form of reality, albeit a symbolic one. This is how the revolutionaries, I think, thought of the Constitution. But at work in the debate of July 2018 was also a totally opposed view of the Constitution, a counter-revolutionary view, I would say, that Burke or Joseph de Maistre would have endorsed. That of the Constitution as reflecting an order that is not the result of human agency. When the deputies affirmed that the suppression of race and the introduction of sex were grounded in a conformity with scientific reality, they applied the Burkean model of the Constitution as, I'm quoting Burke here, as operating on the model of nature. To conclude then, beyond the very obvious and important problem that of the erasure of race, which will certainly diminish the already scant protection that racialized persons have in France today, beyond the silencing of gender and sexual orientation under a biological sex, it seems to me that the very incoherent understanding of the Constitution might be the most pernicious element of this July 2018 revision, as it makes all citizens prisoners of a text that reflect a natural order beyond their will, rather than opening up to a political project for French contemporary society, a project that is very much needed. Thank you.